happy to introduce David, who is a zoologist and ecological consultant with a background in land management and in particular interested in the conservation and ecologies of reptiles and frogs, which he'll be talking to us in the next session, I think. But this session, we'll be talking about the importance of contributing records to the Biodiversity Atlas, which some of us are familiar with, some of us will not be. And some of us are, I think, David, confused about the number of different options that are available now for contributing these sort of citizen science details. There's, seems to me, I can think off the top of my head, though I probably won't name them correctly, of at least 4 different places to send this sort of data. So I'm sure that you will be able to clarify and enlighten us on all these matters. So without further ado, sorry, my apologies, there is a further ado. I should acknowledge the traditional owners of the country on which we are operating at the moment. I don't know where everybody is, but I am in the territory of the Boon Wurrung, who are the people of the bays. That's Western Port and Port Phillip Bay in our contemporary language. And I'm happy to acknowledge their elders, both past and present, and also the elders across Victoria and possibly the world. I have no idea where everyone's coming from. So it's one of the wonders of this kind of internet activity. And I haven't had the time to check everyone's details. So I welcome everybody. I also importantly acknowledge the First Friends of Dandenong Creek, who are the group who are very focused on preserving and protecting the Dandenong Creek on the sort of southeast area of the metropolitan Melbourne. And also explain that the Victorian Environment Friends Network is a Victoria-wide network which tries to pull together the friends groups across Victoria to speak on their behalf, to represent them, to assist with these kind of activities, to spread information, and to try and raise the profile of the important volunteer work that's done by friends across Victoria. So with that, and the final plug that if you are a member of a friends group, you are very welcome tonight. If you are not a member of a friends group, get off your backside and join one, because there will be one in your area or interested in the area that you are interested in terms of the environment. And they are doing important work and they desperately need your assistance. If you are a member of a friends group, then the Victorian Environment Friends Network desperately needs your membership and assistance too. Sorry, David, all the commercials are finished. Over to you.
No worries. Thanks, Paul. Sage advice. So, while we're at it, we should probably at least acknowledge the Wurundjeri, also because their country is on the land that the First Friends of Dandenong Creek work on. And for those of us who are slightly further inland in the Melbourne area, although as you mentioned, Paul, acknowledging that a lot of people are going to be listening in from elsewhere in Victoria and possibly even further afield. But we won't dwell too long looking at the cute sugar gliders on the front cover. We'll get straight into it. Oh, if we can, without any technical glitches. No, maybe Anthony can help.
I was going to say, Dave, just press the arrow key on your keyboard and it should advance to the next slide.
I'm doing that, but without, hang on. I just had my cursor on something else. I thought, all good. Okay. So Paul mentions that some of you may be more familiar with the Victorian Biodiversity Atlas, or VBA, than others. So apologies, this will be a bit of a refresher in that case for those of you who are aware of it. And for those of you who aren't, a bit of an introduction. We won't tonight go so much into the workings of the VBA, apart from superficially. So we'll show you where a lot of the functions are located, but we won't necessarily go through the process of entering data or extracting data tonight. So the VBA, in one way, it's an amalgamation of a lot of legacy systems or historic databases that no longer exist. So if you're not familiar with the VBA, you might have heard of the Flora Information System or the Atlas of Victorian Wildlife. Those databases, all the records from them are now included in the Victorian Biodiversity Atlas. So it's a replacement for those databases, as well as some of the Department of Environment's internal databases, including ones relating to threatened species. So all those records are now concentrated in the VBA, but importantly, it accepts observations or records from just about anyone and everyone who has records of Victorian biodiversity to contribute. So you don't necessarily have to be an industry professional or a researcher or even necessarily belong to a community organisation. You can contribute records as a private individual, as long as you're registered to contribute records to the VBA. And we'll show you how that's done soon. The VBA is a bit unique though compared to some of the other online biodiversity databases, in that the records, well, just about all the records are reviewed by experts, and most of them are with the department. So for example, in the Arthur Ryler Institute, the department's environmental research branch, but with other organisations as well, including Birds Australia and BirdLife, of course, they are now. So each expert that reviews records focuses on their particular group of flora or fauna where their expertise is, before those records get approved for publication. And then become accessible to everyone on the Atlas. I'll discuss a little bit later on the various functions or uses for data within the Atlas, and some of the issues associated with it as well. But this is probably a good point to acknowledge. I have absolutely no involvement with the VBA, apart from being an avid contributor of records, and the real people behind the workings of the Atlas are Mel Hardy and Bev Yen, who currently look after the VBA, and they'll be the ones to help anyone who needs assistance with entering data or other queries around the workings of the Atlas. Okay, Paul suggested there might be maybe 4 other online databases akin to the VBA or that provide options for entering biodiversity data, a few more than that. And this shows you the relationship or the data flow between those other online biodiversity atlases and the VBA, but also where data tends to come from, the different groups that are feeding data into the VBA. as well as the other online databases. I won't dwell on this too much, apart from focusing on a couple of the other databases, being iNaturalist and the Atlas of Living Australia, and how they interact with the VBA. You'll notice though, in the top right-hand corner, we've got an online program or function called NatureKit, which is another one of our Victorian Department of Environment's online tools. And the only reason to focus a little bit on that one is because soon the search and reporting functions that are available currently in the VBA are going to be more or less transferred to NatureKit. So at the moment, if you want to extract data from the VBA, the practice is to go to the Atlas itself, but soon we'll be directed to NatureKit to get that information contained within the VBA. Okay, so I mentioned iNaturalist, and no doubt one that a lot of you are familiar with. It has a fairly user-friendly reputation and a very popular online database. I have to confess, the VBA, among some naturalists who are also IT experts, doesn't have a reputation for being so user-friendly. And so iNaturalist has become the database of choice for a lot of people, in part maybe for that reason. The good news is though, that only recently, well, relatively recently, the VBA has set up an umbrella project in iNaturalist. And that takes in all of the records that are entered, obviously within Victoria, but then only the records that have been validated to research grade. So as I understand it, because I'm not a regular user of iNaturalist, some of you are probably more familiar with it, no doubt, than what I am. If your record is validated or backed up by other users on iNaturalist, then it can attain the status of being a research grade record. And those are the only ones for Victoria that are transferred from iNaturalist into the VBA. So for the VBA, validation's a major factor that influences what records get included, but still not fail safe. And we'll talk a bit more about that. Before we do though, I'll mention the Atlas of Living Australia, only because, as some of you might know, it brings in data from all the online databases holding biodiversity records within Australia, as well as data from the museums and herbaria. So it's all, it can all be found within the Atlas of Living Australia. The caveat to that is though that there tends to be a long delay between, for example, when records get published in the VBA to when they get transferred or uploaded to the Atlas of Living Australia, but they make it in there eventually. And unfortunately, for people who enter their data directly into the Atlas of Living Australia, those records at the moment anyway aren't accepted into the VBA. So the records don't flow the other way. And the reason for that being that there's no, if you like, human or expert validation process for records that get entered directly into the Atlas of Living Australia. It's an algorithm that gets done electronically, but even records that are flagged as potentially having some issues, and I should mention users can flag errors in records on the Atlas of Living Australia as well. Those records still get reported in the search output on the Atlas of Living Australia. And I'll show you an example of that a bit later as well. So this gives you some idea of the different groups that are contributing data to the VBA. And you can see we've got community groups and individual naturalist citizen scientists down the bottom, more or less on par with the volume of data that gets contributed by researchers, academics working within universities and non-government organisations. The vast majority of the data submitted to the VBA is from industry professionals, consultants, followed by government agencies. The one thing that Mel and Bev at the VBA have made a point of emphasising though is that the data that comes from community groups and citizen scientists tends to be of a higher quality than some of the other groups, and a couple of reasons for that, because a lot of that data comes from long-term or longer-term monitoring projects. It tends to be very standardised and repeated, multiple visits to the same sites over a long time. And so that makes that data useful potentially for purposes in addition to just having a standalone observational or incidental record. So we need to, one of the objectives of tonight's presentation is absolutely going to be to try and increase this 16% and get some more groups and individuals contributing data from their citizen science projects. All right. So I mentioned a couple of issues, not necessarily unique to the VBA or the Atlas of Living Australia, but that can become problems across all the various online databases. And one of them is wrongly entered records. And in this example, the location that's incorrect. Obviously, for this species, it's a bat that tends to hang around arid and semi-arid parts of the country. And so in Victoria, that means that it's confined to the very northwest and certainly not in the Otway Ranges. But this record down in the Otways still gets reported when you do a search in the Atlas of Living Australia. So the validation of records doesn't tease out, if you like, or eliminate those incorrectly entered records. One of the other issues that's been recognised a bit more recently, but it's not necessarily a new one, is that that of poaching or potential poaching and habitat disturbance, let alone trespassing onto private land. So this was a conversation piece that David Lindenmeyer and one of his postdoc students, Ben Shiel, wrote on this particular species, pink-tailed worm lizard, having records submitted to one of the atlases, possibly the VBA. And as I mentioned, those records eventually end up in the ALA, the Atlas of Living Australia, and then having people trespass, go onto private land, looking for those records where they'd been undertaking surveys for the species, and then causing issues, regardless of anything else, with the relationship that the researchers had formed with those landowners. For this reason, there's been a recent change in the VBA in that originally it was mainly orchids and a small group of threatened invertebrates, some of the butterflies, for example, that were treated as being sensitive species, and it meant that their records were obscured or diluted to a 1 kilometre grid. That's now been expanded to include a lot of the threatened reptiles and frogs. And it also applies to, for example, nesting sites for some of the rarer birds, some of the parrots and owls, for example. So there are ways, at least, of managing this issue while still enabling people to submit accurate records, for location records for rare and threatened species to the Atlas. Okay, so we've covered some of the issues. What about the uses of the data? So for myself, being an ecological consultant, one of the, I'd argue, more important uses for the data in the VBA is to inform not necessarily the most morally rewarding aspect of the planning process, but when people apply to undertake a development or a subdivision and require an ecological assessment, unfortunately, we're only given limited time to visit the site and assess the land. And there's a heavy reliance on desktop assessment, looking at database records that other people have collected and contributed. In the case of consultants, we are only really required, or standard practice tends to be, that we only go to the VBA, which is unfortunate as well, because a lot of records that people are submitting for threatened species aren't necessarily going into the VBA. And that causes a real issue, because it means that, as some of you are possibly familiar with, a planning application can come up and it may be a sensitive area that development's being proposed in. There may be a threatened species there, but that ends up being missed by the consultants. And it can be for the simple reason that even if someone knows that a threatened species occurs there, the records have gone into one of the other databases and not into the VBA. It's fair to argue that a diligent consultant might then go and consult the rest of those databases to try and see if there are any records that haven't necessarily been contributed to the VBA. But I mentioned that you know, unfortunately, with time and budgets being limited, it tends to be the VBA that's most heavily relied on by consultants. Also because the VBA can have direct legislative implications. And by that I mean, say for threatened species records entered into the Atlas of Living Australia, but not the VBA, the Department of Environment in Victoria doesn't really place any legislative weight or value to that record. It's not really recognised officially. If it's in the VBA, however, it has the potential to have implications beyond knowing that the threatened species is on the property. For example, it's used, records of threatened species in the VBA are used to model, albeit roughly, the distributions of threatened species on private and public land. And there can be resulting implications for proponent of a development to then have to offset or somehow mitigate impacts to areas that are modelled as habitat for those species based on the records in the VBA. Those habitat models don't use records from any of the other databases. Okay, but beyond the consulting world, how can records be used? They can be particularly informative for community groups and have a benefit in some cases for oversight and advocacy. So this example being of an endangered fish, the barred galaxias in the Talangi area. obviously in this part of the world, potentially overlapping with logging coops. So there's the ability to extract data for threatened species such as this, and for example, overlay it with areas that are being harvested for timber or otherwise impacted by other processes. And by the same token, topical at the moment with the fires that have occurred in East Gippsland, doing things like overlapping records with fire maps and that sort of thing, to look at the proximity of various disturbances or processes in relation to the records. So this is publicly available information. One of the biggest issues we have though is for people who are in an advocacy or oversight role or position to take up a case for particular species, not necessarily knowing that this data is available, let alone accessible to the public in the VBA, or how to extract it. And it can also be used for more quantitative research. So in this case, Andrew Harmer, who used to be with the Botanic Gardens when they had their Research Centre for Urban Ecology, looking at using records within the VBA to predict the likelihood of various frogs and reptiles persisting in the Melbourne area. Although there's one obvious issue with that, it's true that there are a lot more records being contributed to the VBA and the other atlases now than what there were historically. So there's a bias there in that you've got a lot more recent records of particular species compared to the past, and it can obscure what's happening with the decline of particular threatened species if that's not taken into account. Okay, so we're just about to the point of launching into the Atlas itself, but to get there, we've got the website up the top, but if you Google Victorian Biodiversity Atlas, it'll get you there. Don't just Google VBA, or else it'll give you a million other options that aren't the Atlas, like the Victorian Building Authority. But once you get to the front page of the VBA, scroll down a little bit to the section about the VBA, and there are a few drop-down options. One of them, and one of the more important ones, being downloading the VBA user guides. So it'll expand to give you a whole list of cheat sheets to all of the VBA's various functions. And this tends to be one of the most useful places to go to get help before you necessarily start emailing the team at the VBA, Melanie and Bev, for assistance. Scroll down a bit further and you get to a blue button which takes you to the Atlas. So I mentioned if you really get stuck with any of the functions or entering data, the VBA help email addresses down the bottom of the screen, and you should keep note of that. It's available on the website as well, so you'll be able to find it, hopefully, if you need it. But Mel and Bev are almost always willing to help when people have issues that they can't necessarily get around themselves. And also, importantly, and particularly for friends groups and other community organisations, if you want data to be attributed or tied to an organisation like a Friends group, if the Friends group or organisation otherwise isn't already registered in the VBA to contribute to data, the first thing you'll need to do before you start contributing records is to have the organisation's name registered in the VBA. And the only way to do that is to email Mel and Bev at vba.help@del.vic.gov.au, and they have to enter the organisation's name from their end. The good news is they do it all the time, and it's a fairly quick and straightforward process at their end, but it has to be done at their end. Once they've done that, you can then register yourself in the VBA as an individual associated or affiliated with that organisation and start contributing records. I should also mention, if you've been undertaking monitoring for a particular species or group of species using one of the more novel survey methods, so I've got here, for example, a remote acoustic recorder. So I know that some of the Friends groups have been working with the VNPA, for example, doing acoustic recording using song meters. That method in particular isn't included as an option in the VBA at the moment, but it should be. And no doubt very soon, as soon as somebody emails Mel and Bev and asks them if that method can be included in the method options in the VBA, you'll be able to select it for the method that you've used to get the record of the plant or animal or whatever it might be. And I'll also go through what you do if you have an incidental observation. You haven't used the particular method or technique to get it. Okay, now that we've come to the end of that, we'll switch across to the real thing. Okay, so once you click on that blue button, this is where you'll come to. And I'll very quickly show you. For those of you who are already registered in the VBA, you obviously won't need to register again, you can sign right in. But for those of you who haven't, click on sign up to the right of the login button. And it's a very quick and easy form. They've streamlined the registration process. So I mentioned the step before this is to register the organisation that you're with, assuming that the organisation isn't already in the VBA. Now you can find this out on this personal or individual registration form when you get toward the bottom. So obviously you're filling in your personal details, your contact email, choose a password, and then at the bottom you've got an option to select an organisation that's already registered in the VBA. And if we quickly scroll through that list, there's a good number of them, but all of the Friends groups are obviously going to be in the F section, and we can see which Friends groups are currently registered in the VBA. So if you're not sure whether your group's registered already, this is a good place to check. And if you see that your organisation name isn't in this list, then that'll prompt you to email Mel and Bev at the VBA, and they'll add the group to this list for you. So once that's done, you pick your group. So we'll go Friends of Tarrawalga. and then select your primary use or purpose for entering data into the VBA. So for industry professionals, there are options. For researchers, there are options. And for us citizen scientists, the default option is amateur naturalist. Once you've filled in your details, click the terms and conditions, click sign up, and it'll take a day or two for Mel and Bev to approve you to be able to contribute data to the VBA. Okay, so we'll go back. Assuming then that you've registered. Oh, I will mention quickly, you can log in as a guest, but that'll only enable you to see summary data, effectively lists of species, and you can still search for species records within the VBA for a given or defined area as a guest, but you won't be able to contribute data to the Atlas as a guest. You have to register. Once you've registered, it will enable you to log in, hopefully, and occasionally take its sweet time to get there. But it's probably worth noting that the VBA works better on some browsers than others. So not to promote any particular one, but Chrome's often better with the VBA. And then once you're in, this is what you'll see. Now, I should probably mention in the up on the right, and if I, here we are. You've got my details. If you click on that, it'll give you the option of adding additional organisations to your profile. And later, when you come to entering records, you can take in or out the relevant organisations that you want or don't want affiliated with the records that you're entering. But at this point, it can be useful to include as many organisations that you're a member of, in case later on when you're entering records, you need to tie them to one of the organisations that you're affiliated with. Okay, we'll get out of that. Now, very quickly, we'll show you where each of the functions are. So you notice the top couple of options under data entry are my projects and my general observations. And these fundamentally depend on what sort of records you're wanting to enter as to which one you go into. So if we go into my observations, this is for the standalone incidental records. So for example, a powerful owl in the reserve down the road that's not necessarily being recorded as part of a survey. So if we go into one as an example, what have we got? So this is a good example, region parrots on the side of the Corridor Highway. And being a threatened species, a good one to register in the VBA, even though they do travel around a fair bit. And this shows you what data you're entering when you enter an incidental observation like this. So the red dots indicate what fields are mandatory. You can't submit the records without having those fields filled in. So being what group of organism is it a terrestrial animal, a plant, an aquatic animal. You have to enter site information. The value of going through this quickly is also that you go through this same or similar process when you're entering records for a project. Although there is another way of entering records for a project, which I'll show you briefly. But to enter a site, so we can see where the site is there. And fortunately, this gives us a satellite option, which you can use not only to help see where the existing records are, but you use this to plot your record. You can either plug in GPS coordinates if you have them, and it gives you the option of plugging coordinates in all the different formats: easting, northing, UTM coordinates, or Latin long, decimal degrees, or degrees, minutes, seconds. And the VBA can handle any of that. Or you can select to plot your point directly onto the map. As mentioned, the red dots are the fields that you have to fill in. So give your site a name, obviously, a location description, and the VBA administrators tend to like a more detailed description there. As I said, sites can be flagged as sensitive later, as long as you're detailed in your initial description of the site. Don't worry too much about people trespassing onto private property that you might not want them to, or going after sensitive species, because that'll be obscured later. Okay, so once your site information is entered, it then gives you the option of selecting a species. So in this case, we did Regent Parrot, but we'll very quickly show you more or less any species within Victoria, plant or animal or fungus or anything else, should be in the VBA, unless it's a species that's recorded new for the state, or an invertebrate. There are a lot of invertebrates already in the Atlas as options. For example, if we went something that's not found anywhere near this area, Elfin copper butterfly, we've got the option for that there. And if we wanted to, we could add it, but we have to say how many. Well, you don't necessarily have to say how many you've seen, but you have to say what sort of record it was. We'll say that it was seen, and you have to select yourself as an observer or whoever else observed it, if the option's there, in which case you'll have more than one observer listed for this observation on the main page. So I'll show you quickly. The observers, the contributors are all there. If you click on Manage Contributors, it'll let you choose.
Sorry, David.
Oh, yep.
We just had a question on the chat that is probably relevant at this moment. Who assigns the site ID?
Yes. Site ID number gets created once you've created the site. So once you enter all those site details, it'll generate a site ID number for you. Yep. And it's worth taking note of that number if you're going to be entering records for that same site later on or into the future, because it means that when it comes to that time, rather than re-entering all those site names and location details again, you can just enter the site ID number and those details will automatically appear. So in this case, we're looking at if you've got more than one contributor. This list gives you every person that's registered in the VBA. So if you're friend or associates recorded the thing that you want to enter into the VBA, you can find their name in this list if they're registered, and then transfer them across. I'm not sure who that person is, but they've been transferred across, and then you would click apply and close. In this case, we don't want to, so we'll take them back using the arrows to do that. We'll close that. Okay. Now, once you've got all those details entered, you click validate and submit in the bottom left-hand corner. But before we do that, I'm going to make sure that I don't have this Eltham copper butterfly down there. No, we deleted it. Good. But I'll show you what it looks like when you then go to validate your record and submit it for publication. Okay, region parrot. It's given a rating of 4, which suggests that it's a threatened taxon new to the region, which might seem a bit odd because we know that region parrots are up in that part of the world. All that means is these ratings in the top right-hand corner, all it really means is that in this case, nobody else has bothered to record region parrot within a reasonable distance of that point. That's all. So the next time that someone records region parrots on the side of the Calder Highway in wherever I was in 2012, it'll come up with a rating of probably 0. So that the taxon will be considered valid for that region in terms of where the records are located that are in the VBA. Once you've done that, you click continue and a little message box will come up to say that your record's been submitted for approval or for review. So we'll close both of those eventually, and loading data. And you'll be able to see that in the status column. So records that you've submitted for review are going to look like eventually when it thinks about it, here. So you'll see it'll say ready for review as opposed to approved. There's a stage between the records being ready for review and approved, and that's obviously when the records are under review. And that happens periodically, not necessarily very regularly, but every few months, the records tend to be transferred to being under review. And when they're under review, they're locked for editing. In fact, when you submit them for review, you can't change or edit those records again until the time that they're approved. If you realise that you've made a mistake though, the best course of action is to email Bev and Mel at the Atlas, and they'll be able to unlock the record so that you can edit it. But they tend, I think, to like not having to do that. So if you're confident that your record's correct before you hit that submit button, that's probably the best thing. Okay, now very quickly, because I'm conscious that we're running out of time, the top option is My Projects. So we'll go into that. Now that we've been through the process of what entering a record looks like, we won't go through that again, but I'll very quickly show you what a project looks like. So setting up a project obviously tends to be better suited for project data, for monitoring data. And if we go into one as an example, The difference between the main difference between entering a project and a standalone incidental observation being that a project has a front page, if you like, and it looks like this, fairly similar to the incidental or general observation. Again, you can choose multiple contributors who have been a part of the project to assign records to. You can include a permit if you have animal ethics approval or a department research permit or an aquatic survey permit, and then you give it a project name and description. Once you've done that, you can enter surveys for your project, which is the notepad and pencil icon to the right of the magnifying glass, which is the front page to your project. And this is what it looks like when you've entered surveys. So if we go into one, now what defines a survey depends mainly on two things. A separate site or separate GPS coordinates constitutes a separate survey in the VBA, as can separate dates for when you've recorded the data, or using a separate method if it's very different. Mainly the difference between surveying for fauna versus flora, so that broad. But within a survey, there is the ability to choose multiple methods for the group of organisms that you're monitoring or looking for. So in this case, we've got targeted search, which has been selected, and we can have a look at very quickly at how we do that, or where we do that. So again, click on the magnifying glass, the front page for the survey, and that's where you're entering your survey data. And as mentioned again, it's the red dots that are essential. You can't progress beyond that point until you've filled in those fields. But once you've done that, you can go to enter your species for that particular method. So in this case being targeted search, in exactly the same way that you enter species. Well, we've got flora here, so let's do something like exactly the same as you'd enter species when you're entering an individual incidental or general observation. And again, if you've got several people as options in the front page of your project, you can select their name here as the person who recorded that particular species, and then add them. Add the record, and it should appear below eventually. Whoop, no, it failed for some reason. But it gives you the general idea. We've been through this process before, and it's good that it failed because we don't want, because I'm not able to edit this project, that's why. So, which is fine because I don't want slender speedwell in this species list. So if we close that, there is, so we're almost done, I think, but I will mention there is a potentially easier way of entering project records if you don't want to go through this manual process all the time. What it requires is that you, at the very least, set up the front page to your project so that you fill in the project name and associated details and contributors. Once you've done that, you can fill in an Excel spreadsheet and do a batch upload. There are separate batch upload templates or Excel spreadsheets for flora versus terrestrial fauna versus aquatic fauna. And to get access to them, you have to email the Mel and Bev, the people with the VBA, at vba.help, and they'll send you those templates as well as enable you the function of being able to upload them. So very quickly, if we download this file, okay, and this is showing you how that data gets formatted in the batch upload template. It's not always as straightforward as registering one record per line, but it almost is. And this is a good example of that because people get caught out. So in this case, we've got a blank row in row 3. The reason for that being, we've started entering that top record in row number 2, and we've come across, we've entered the location details, the GPS coordinates. But when we've got to the method details, these numbers won't mean much to you now, but in the original template, there are explanations as to what these numbers correspond to. The only reason
we're not actually seeing that, David.
Yeah, sorry. Hang on. Apologies for that. Now you are. Okay. We'll be very quick. So we've opened the Excel spreadsheet. This is what the final upload format looks like. So in this case, we've got a bunch of records for the Southern Toadlet. I was saying it's not quite as straightforward as entering one record per line in the spreadsheet, but it almost is. I'll show you what I mean. If we look at this top one, so we've got the project ID number, which you have to transfer across from when you set the project up. We've got the login names for the contributors. You then enter your location details. So you create your location in here if you don't already have one created in the VBA. Then you get to entering method details. And in this case, we've got the number 70 and an associated couple of method details, the numbers 6 and 108. And I can't even tell you what those numbers stand for. But the template that you use to create this data or this upload spreadsheet explains to you what those numbers correspond to. So at a guess, 70 is going to be something like visual nighttime survey, spotlighting. 6 might be the total number of hours that you looked, or minutes, or something like that. Or that might be 108 minutes, for example. 6 might be the number of lights. So the number of people with headlamps or torches. They have to be entered, the method details, directly underneath the row that you've started entering data in. So it's because for method 70, we've got 2 method details here. Whatever 6 is, head torches, number of lamps, and whatever 108 is, number of minutes that you surveyed. Then you enter a numerical value for those, is that right? Sampling detail. The useful thing is that when you start entering this data in the original template, it explains what all of these fields mean. It's much easier looking at that than what I'm showing you now, which is the final format that you upload to the VBA, which is very rudimentary. And the reason for that is that the VBA won't be able to handle all that additional help information that's in the template that you actually work in. So you're actually copying and pasting the raw values, the raw data into this final template. So, as I mentioned, we have titlets associated with all of these records. Taxon code is generated automatically, as are the common name or scientific name. When you go to enter this data in the original template, it's predictive. There are macros that will help you streamline entering the species details. And then the count. Obviously, the number that you've seen, the type of observation. Again, these letters correspond with particular methods. H, I'm guessing, is heard. And presumably there'll be S for seen. So you'll be able to choose that in the original upload template that you're working in. Behaviour, B, I'm guessing is going to stand for breeding. And the final thing you do is choose your observer username. Even though you might have multiple observers contributing to this project, you can only attribute the record, each record, to one of them. So at the very end, you're picking one to attribute each of those records to, but you can attribute the different records to different observers. They don't have to be the same all the way down the spreadsheet. Okay, so
how are we going, David?
I reckon we're pretty much done. The only thing that I'll finish up with now is if I can get the share screen back in the VBA. Okay, so hopefully everyone can see that we're back in the VBA. The only thing that I'll finish up on is to say that you then progress obviously to upload the Excel template, and it'll tell you usefully where any errors are in the data that you've entered and where you need to go in the spreadsheet to fix those errors. And it may take several attempts to upload them, but you get there eventually. Okay, other than that, that's a fairly whirlwind tutorial on the VBA. Hopefully most of that made sense to you. But even then, you'll find that the more that you use it, like anything, but particularly with the VBA, I think, the more confident you'll become at entering records, and the less you'll have to email Mel and Bev at the Atlas to get help. But for whatever it's worth, I'd encourage any of the groups that you're affiliated with to, for the reasons I've explained, if you're not already registered in the Atlas as a group, to consider doing that, and then registering yourselves if you have valuable data to input, because it'll certainly come in handy for the profession that I'm in, but for multiple other uses as well. Okay, I think we're there. Thanks very much.
Okay. So, and just sort of from a personal point of view, my friends group has been doing lyrebird surveys in our park for some years, and we haven't done anything with them. But it's probably important to say that we should be doing uploading it to this kind of data. I'll quickly run through a couple of questions, David, that have come through on the chat line, and I'll start kind of from the bottom because I think it's the most general. What's the benefit of directly adding via VBA over iNat,
Yes.
reaching research grade? I'm not sure what the last words mean, but
yeah,
as I guess I started out saying, is that there does seem to be a number of options, and and we've had a couple of questions that kind of reach the VBA versus iNat.
Yeah, and a very good question, and one that I didn't touch on an important point for, and that is the only advantage of entering those records directly into the VBA and not iNaturalist first is that if the records don't attain research grade, if they don't qualify as a research grade, then they won't be carried across to the VBA. So I mentioned, and as I said, there are going to be people listening who are more familiar with how records attain that status of research grade than what I am. But as I understand it, it's if multiple other people, a certain number of other people, have agreed with your identification, or say that your photo is of a particular species. And if you get enough validation that way, or from enough people, it'll get flagged or tagged as being a research grade. The VBA will only accept and carry over the records that have that tag with them, that are being tagged as research grade. Any records that haven't had other people validate the identification of whatever it is remain in iNaturalist, obviously, but they won't be carried across to the VBA. So the only way I see that really being an issue is if there's particularly a threatened species having records entered into iNaturalist, and those records aren't getting to research grade, because it means that those threatened species records won't ultimately end up in the VBA. But otherwise, and so maybe it's better for incidental data, for standalone records, and certainly if you were monitoring a threatened species, my advice, for whatever it's worth, would be to contribute those records directly to the VBA rather than iNaturalist, to guarantee, well, more or less guarantee that they'll be published in the VBA after the expert review.
Okay, which probably answers probably a couple of questions which are related to, are the iNaturalist records automatically transferred across? The answer clearly is no, unless they are deemed research grade.
Correct. Yeah.
There's a couple of questions about the how would I say it? The specificity of locations, let's say, for example, from Laura, iNaturalist, if you don't want to identify your property details for privacy reasons, you can enter a more generic around this area type location for public view. Would records like this, denoted as research grade, enter the VBA, or can you be less specific with lat long in VBA data entry? If that's not too complex.
Yep, no, thankfully the answer is fairly straightforward. So, but it's in two parts, of course. So, yes, if you don't want to be as specific in iNaturalist for privacy reasons or security reasons, but your record gets to research grade and it gets carried over to the VBA. For the moment, the records tend to be published with those much less descriptive location details. They're not being weeded out necessarily. Having said that though, the preference from the VBA's end is to have as accurate location details as possible for records, because it makes them more useful for what the records are being used for. If people are worried about having too detailed locations in the VBA associated with their records for privacy or security reasons, I mentioned there was a way of flagging records as sensitive. Now you can do that yourself when you go through that process of entering location details. So I didn't show it, but there is actually a button to the left of the button you click on to enter location details that says something along the lines of flag site as sensitive, or something to that effect. So you can obscure location details yourself by clicking that button. You should still enter accurate location details though, because the Department of Environment will have access to those accurate details for anyone that needs to see them. But it just means that the public won't be able to see them. It'll be diluted to the 1 kilometre grid. And when you go to drag out those records out of the VBA, it'll tell you location details not provided, site sensitive. So yeah, the iNaturalist one's a bit trickier, as I said. So yes, your research grade records can still end up in the VBA, even if your location details aren't as accurate.
So, and just following up in a way, I think, so with the data going to the VBA, there is notification of things in an area when planning applications are being assessed. That's correct?
Yes, well, very briefly, example, yeah, the standard process will be a consultant when there's a planning application, assuming that a consultant's been engaged to assess it, or the ecological aspect, will go straight to the VBA and drag out all the records for that site. That's right. And within a buffer distance, so say 5 kilometres, it usually is, from the boundary of that property. Yeah.
This is a slightly obscure one, I think, but to me, are the iNat records of mine that have been transferred to VBA being attributed to me so I can search on my iNat username? Bit of a technicality there.
No, unfortunately not. So the well, not that I'm familiar with. They send the records are coming up as iNaturalist as the observer. So that's it's a good point actually, because that's another potential disadvantage. So if someone for whatever reason wanted their name attributed to a record in the VBA, then I'd consider entering that record through the VBA rather than iNat. Pragmatically though, what difference does that make? Only that if a researcher or a consultant, for example, wanted to follow up on a record, they wouldn't be able to see who recorded it, but then potentially follow it up, or even contact the people in the department and find out from them who recorded that. You'd have to go a roundabout way, I guess, and go to iNat and see if you can find out who the observer is that way.
I'm not sure about this one, so I'll ask if Kathy Powers is still with us. Could you unmute and make your point again? It's that I think the ALA is planning to remove the recording a site function. Kathy, are you still with us? No. Okay, we'll have to skip that because I'm not quite sure.
Yeah, well, it's probably
I think
yeah, not one that I can help.
I think the I think the import of it is that the ALA is now recommending observations be uploaded to iNaturalist.
Okay.
So
that's interesting.
For what that's worth. Okay, David, thank you. There's a lot of thank yous here on the chat section. So I'll just say generically a lot of thank yous to you and for your clear working through of the process. And certainly I'll be urging our group to chase it up, and I hope a lot of groups and individuals indeed that are listening will do so.